Bonsoir. Good evening, everyone. Mon nom est Alain Dansuger, je suis directeur général de la Bibliothèque publique juive. So welcome to tonight's event. Prior to this event, some of you may have been there. We had a very exciting launch of our 25-26 season. So I'm going to be very short. We have an exciting new season. Make sure that you double check our website, a new website that will be operational at the end of September, jewishpubliclibrary.org. Everything, and I mean everything, will be there, including the new series of these authors from home, which is being integrated tonight with Tara and Sam. We'll go into a conversation on Lea Roback, well-known figure, of course, and particularly close to our hearts because we have a lot of materials that we have in the archives. I'm sure that Sam is going to talk about it. That's it for me. Welcome, bienvenue. Et j'aimerais maintenant inviter Mélanie Lévy. Je voudrais vraiment remercier la Fondation Lea Roback pour son appui à cet événement. J'aimerais inviter Mélanie à vous dire quelques mots. Merci. Bonne soirée.
Merci beaucoup d'être ici. De la part de la Fondation Lea Roback, on est très fiers d'être ici ce soir pour souligner l'importante contribution de Lea Roback, qui a toujours placé la justice sociale au cœur de ses engagements politiques, syndicaux et féministes. Il allait de soi que la Fondation appuie concrètement l'initiative de Tara Goldstein et de la Bibliothèque publique juive de réunir autour d'un hommage à Lea Roback des personnes qui l'ont connue, aimée et admirée tout autant pour la personne attachante qu'elle était que pour la militante convaincue et tenace qu'elle était. La Fondation, créée en 1993 à l'occasion de son 90e anniversaire, continue de promouvoir ces valeurs chères au cœur de Léa. Juste cette année, la Fondation a attribué 36 bourses pour un montant total de plus que 83 000 $. Et depuis 1994, la Fondation a attribué 414 bourses pour un montant total de 774 000 $ et plus. Donc, merci beaucoup pour votre appui constant à notre action de remise de bourse d'études à des femmes engagées socialement, mais défavorisées économiquement. Cela montre bien que nous partageons les valeurs que Léa trouvait importantes et que les valeurs que Léa trouvait importantes sont importantes pour vous aussi. Merci beaucoup et bonne soirée. Merci.
For just saying hello to our friends on the live stream as well. Hello, welcome everyone. Merci Alain et merci Mélanie aussi pour vos aimables paroles. Donc, I would like to invite Tara. I know you had a few words you wanted to say before we begin this event.
Thank you so much. I have some thank yous, and I actually brought some notes so I don't forget everybody. So first to Sam Pappas and Maya Pasternak at the Jewish Public Library for their incredible support when I began my archival research with the Lea Roback dossier, which is here in the archives at the Jewish Public Library. And to Yael Guta, thank you so much for organizing this event. You worked so hard on this, and I appreciate all your attention to detail. Here we are, and we are live streaming, and I'm going to acknowledge some of the people who are on live stream in a moment. I also want to acknowledge some special guests who are here. Sophie Bissonnette, my cousin Melanie Levitt, my stepmother Louise Goldstein, my wife Margot, and my friends Karen and David, who came from Toronto to be here in person. And they brought some Montrealers who I haven't seen since high school with them. It's so wonderful. Sophie and Melanie read some preliminary drafts of the book, of the biography, and they provided me as content editors with feedback. Margot and Karen and my research assistants, who I think are online, Mia Jacobson and Chloe Thurstein, they proofread the final draft. We had about 6 eyes on it, and I had them help me before we sent it off to the publisher. I want to give a shout out to all the Roback and Goldstein family and friends who are joining us online. And finally, I want to thank my publisher, David Parker from Lived Places Publishing, for his excitement and support of the biography, and to thank him for donating 50 copies of the book to be distributed tonight. Thank you, David. So we have already heard from Melanie. Thank you so much for talking about the Lea Roback Foundation. And I thought we would begin with reading a part of the book. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we do that?
I wanted to give a brief background of how I got to know Tara. So basically in January 2024, Tara Goldstein came to the archives of the Jewish Public Library in order to begin research on this book. So that was about almost 2 years ago now, and it is such an honor to see the work that came from that, because I see a lot of researchers come into our archives, and to be able to hold the fruits of their work is really so special, and to read it and to see these stories come to life, because I'll talk about this more, but the Lea Roback collection is one of the most consulted fonds in our archives. It's truly such a coup de cœur, special collection. So to see something so special come out of it has been really wonderful. So I want to let you now go into your reading, but I wanted to just thank you for inviting me to sit here and speak with you today, because it's really such an honor.
We had such a nice time. I was here for about 3 or 4 days. It was January and it was very cold, but I wanted to go on a tour that my cousin Melanie Levitt does in the summer when it's not cold and it's very warm, about the history of leftist Jewish Montreal. And Melanie said, well, it's going to be cold, but I'll take you. We'll have a private tour. And I invited Sam, and the three of us went and hung out and talked about Auntie Lea, and it was a really special archival research trip. So I thought what I would do is just read from the very beginning of the book, because if you haven't had a chance to know my Auntie Lea, this will give you a little bit of an introduction. So I'm going to start at the very beginning. Lea Roback, Her Life and Times. It starts with a quote. How's that, better? Yeah, great. It starts with a quote. Knitting isn't my passion. Social causes are. My great aunt Lea Roback was a force. She was brave, bold, fiercely intelligent, well-read, politically astute, and funny. Like her sister, my grandmother Rose, and the other Roback siblings, Auntie Lea was a compelling storyteller. And much of what I knew about the injustices in the world in my childhood and adolescence came from listening to my family and Auntie Lea herself tell stories about her activist work. Social causes were Auntie Lea's passion. My cousin Melanie Levitt, a public historian who leads walking tours in Montreal about the Jewish left movement in the 1930s and 1940s, describes Auntie Lea as a trailblazing feminist, labor organizer, communist, and peace activist whose activities spanned 7 decades. In the 2024 podcast, Recollections, produced right here by the Jewish Public Library, about the history of the Jewish left in Montreal, Levitt, who was one of the folks who was interviewed, says Auntie Lea pretty much saw every important moment in the left throughout the 20th century. She was a fixture in marches and at protests well into the 1980s and 1990s, and she never retired from her commitment to social justice work. This is a quote from Melanie. It was a lifelong commitment, and it's interesting because Lea was someone who was never one who would rest on her laurels of past accomplishments. She was always adapting and evolving and changing with the times and with changing with new concerns, and always very open to looking at who are the present day people who are being marginalized. Where is my attention and my activism most needed now. For Levitt, Auntie Lea's openness to new ideas was one of her great strengths as an activist. It prevented her activism from becoming fossilized. Another great strength was Auntie Lea's ability to build bridges between communities. She spoke Yiddish, French, and English fluently, which enabled her to connect with multiple communities: Anglophone, Francophone, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, middle class, and working class, first in the labor and suffrage movements of the 1930s and 1940s, and then in the anti-war and women's movements between the 1960s and the 1990s. Born to a Jewish immigrant family on the 3rd of November, 1903 in Montreal, Auntie Lea grew up in the rural French-speaking community of Beauport, just outside Quebec City, where her parents ran a small general store. Like other Jewish families from Eastern Europe living in French-speaking communities, Auntie Lea learned to speak Yiddish at home, French to the neighbors, and English at school. She remained fluent in all three languages all her life and was able to easily switch back and forth among them. Coming from a Jewish family, Auntie Lea and her 8 brothers and sisters were not permitted to attend the local French Catholic elementary school in Beauport because they were not Catholic. In the early 1900s, the school system in Quebec was separated by religion. Children being raised in Catholic families went to Catholic elementary and secondary schools. Children raised in Protestant families went to Protestant schools. At the time, Jews living in Quebec didn't have the same constitutional rights to education as Protestants and Catholics did. However, in 1903, the year Auntie Lea was born, the Quebec provincial government created a stipulation in the Education Act, which designated Jews living in Quebec as honorary Protestants for educational purposes, so that the Protestant school boards in the province could receive funding for Jewish students. This was because by 1901, the Jewish population in Montreal had reached 7,000 people, and there were more and more Jewish children going to Protestant schools. A decade later, the Montreal Jewish community quadrupled to 28,000 people and represented 5% of the city's population. While most Jewish immigrants in Quebec settled in Montreal, some families made homes in other cities and rural communities like Quebec City, Trois-Rivières, Sherbrooke, Joliette. Like the Roback family, most of these families made a living by running small retail businesses. Every day, from Monday to Friday, Auntie Lea and her siblings took a train from the French-speaking Catholic community of Beauport to go to an English Protestant school in Quebec City. They started the school day by singing the British national anthem, God Save the King, reciting the Protestant Lord's Prayer, and singing 1 or 2 Christian hymns. At the end of the school day, they took the train back to Beauport, traveling between a Yiddish-speaking Jewish home, a French-speaking Catholic community, and an English-speaking Protestant school as a child gave Auntie Lea linguistic and cultural skills that became foundational to her future activist work in Quebec. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara, for reading this introduction to your book, which really already provides such a important and really grand context behind your great aunt Lea's upbringing, behind what have helped her become who she became in her later years and even in her youth. So I wanted to open up with our first question of, do you know whether or what people's existing perceptions of your Auntie Lea were as you went into writing this biography?
So I would say for her family, she was known to, I would say for her family, she was known as like bold and fearless. She had strong opinions about lots of things. Coca-Cola was used to polish silver buttons, and white bread was nylon, And Kraft cheese in the little plastic envelopes, that was plastic. I think for the people who marched with her at the rallies and the protests, she was an inspiration. And for Sophie Bissonnette, who did a documentary film about my Auntie Lea called A Vision in the Darkness, Des Lumières dans la Grande Noirceur, she was somebody who was very important and was really a light in some very dark times historically in Quebec, particularly the regime of Maurice Duplessis.
And I really love how you bring attention to these different perspectives because, as I mentioned, I am the reference archivist at the Jewish Public Library, and within her collection, we really do see all of these different perceptions reflected to different extents. So it's really incredible to see someone who is able to experience different parts of her life as her great niece, as her researcher, and also as a friend to people who also were influenced by her. Alternately, I wanted to see if your research changed in any ways your perception of your Auntie Lea.
I don't think the research actually changed my perceptions, but certainly the research deepened what I knew about her. And importantly, the conversations I had with some of my Roback cousins while I was actually writing the book and afterwards when they started reading it, that also deepened my understanding of Auntie Lea. I think the part that I was more unaware of was what her life was like in her later years, in her late 80s and her early 90s. By then, I was no longer living in Montreal. I had gone to Toronto to do doctoral work, and I ended up staying and working at the University of Toronto. I visited frequently, but I didn't have that sense of what her life was like day by day. And there was a beautiful profile piece done by journalist Susan Schwartz. You may know Susan's byline from the Gazette. And she must have spent a lot of time with Auntie Lea, and she did a beautiful profile piece. And I really got a sense of what her life was like. And once she moved from her own apartment in Côte des Neiges to a senior's residence, she had a beautiful routine. There was a steep hill up Victoria Street, and she would walk that 3 times a day. And she would read 2 newspapers, one French, one English. And then when she wasn't doing that, she was reading biographies and serious novels. And I think what struck me was that she was totally engaged with her world. She was and kept an optimism that many folks don't keep in their older years. And I loved reading about that profile, and I loved seeing how she grew older and how her activism, as Melanie said, never ceased.
I have to say, I'm 28 years old and I definitely don't go walking up and down a hill 3 times a day. So yeah, it's really inspirational to hear that and to hear these stories of an older woman, which you don't always hear, being spread and publicized in someone so prolific as Susan Schwartz's profiles. You mentioned in your book early on that you had 3 reasons that inspired you to write this biography. So those 3 reasons are to cross borders or to build bridges between different groups and communities, to share your Auntie Lea's story with an English-speaking audience, and also to share stories of her activism with future generations of educators. So these are the why, and I wanted to ask if there's a why now that you chose to write this book.
There may be people here who remember in August 2023, Canada Post produced a stamp with my Auntie Lea on it, alongside with the stamp of Madeleine Perron and Monique Simone Chopin. Yeah. And they were the 3 Quebec feminists that Canada Post honored. And I was asked to come to the event and say a few words. And Unfortunately, I wasn't able to come, but Canada Post sent a videographer to my house, and so I practiced my French and I did a little video. But the person from the family who was able to go was Melanie Levitt, and Louise Goldstein, my stepmom. She was there too and spoke beautiful French, if I can say so. When she talked about my Auntie Leah, we were all very proud of you both, and we're so glad you were there. I don't know if you remember this, Melanie, but after that reception, after that honor, you wrote to the whole entire family, and you wrote about how special it was and how proud you were of Auntie Leah. And I felt so badly that I hadn't been there. I couldn't join in the excitement. And I said to myself, somebody needs to write a biography. And then I said, you're a writer. You know how to research. That could be you. And I just want to talk a little bit about the publisher who I chose to publish the biography. Lived Places Publishing is located in the UK, and they are a new independent publisher. David Parker, who donated the books today, he's the force behind Lived Places Publishing, and their mandate is to make sure that new narratives of people's experiences who are not usually represented in university courses and the high school courses are made accessible so that they can layer some of the other academic work the profs in universities and the high school teachers in high schools are using with their students. And he has a business model which allows libraries and universities and schools to have access to his books for a very reasonable price, because his interest is getting them into the hands of students. And so that was a perfect match for me. And I'm looking at the live streaming to say, thank you, David, for having such a vision for such a publishing company, because it was the perfect match.
It really was a perfect match. And something that I wanted to note is that this book, the EPUB and the PDF are both open access online,
right.
which makes it more accessible to students, to researchers, but also to the general public, which is really such a great way to get her story out there and to get similar stories out there. And something else that I wanted to remark upon in this particular approach to your biography is that you use a lot of direct quotes from your Auntie Leah, from her interviews and from the Les Lumières dans les Grandes Noirceurs. So I wanted to ask actually if you would feel comfortable reading aloud one of these quotes from the book.
Certainly. Just before I do, I just wanted to say, when I started to think about how I was going to use the archival research material that I found and what pieces of the archive was I really drawn to, I was totally drawn to the interviews that folks had done in both French and English. And I realized what was important to me was to hear Auntie Leah's voice again. So one of my priorities was, when I could, is to make sure I included as many stories as I could. So I'm going to read one, and it's a story about after the 1937 dressmaker strike, which I think you're going to see a little bit about later on in our interview today. Auntie Leah became a union representative for the International Lady Garment Union. And there it is.
You
Thank
see
you.
her up there holding flowers in the bits. Yes, right there.
Oh, perfect. And I'm just looking for the quote. So she was in charge of making sure that when people needed a worker, that they went by rules of seniority. And there was a woman named Helene who was next in line to get the next job to be a draper. And Helene was Black, and when she was sent to the factory to take the job, she was told the job was filled. So Auntie Leah was furious. It was a moment of racism as far as she could tell. And this is the story she tells about that moment. I called him and spoke in Yiddish. Haven't you heard of Hitler? What does that got to do with it? I sent you our most competent draper, and it's up to you to accept her. She's Black. She won't fit into my shop. Listen, sir. Hitler is in power today because Jews like you have left the door open to racism. You won't get another Draper. It's Helen or no one. So he calls Shane, Bernard Shane, the person who headed the ILGWU in Montreal. And Shane comes to see me, brings up the same arguments, and I repeat mine. Then he calls the boss and tries to convince him to give Helen a chance. You know, I've got a Calamity Jane in my office talking about me. The boss still refuses, but the next day he calls. Now he agrees to Helen. I told him he didn't deserve her. That's how Helen got the job. And he had no trouble at all because of her. It was him, that bastard, who had a problem. When you're part of a minority, you should never forget it. It was damn racism, rooted in an ignorant mind. And then, because I had access to lots of different interviews, I found the ending of that story, which didn't show up in the original interview. It was an ending that Auntie Lea told Sophie Bissonnette in the documentary. He, the factory boss, called me a few months later. She's fantastic. He had the nerve to tell me that it wasn't him who was against her, it was the workers. Do you see there the way out? It wasn't the workers. Auntie Lea.
Thank you so much for sharing this story and for sharing her voice, which is such a unique voice and so passionate. And you can really feel how strongly she feels within these quotes, which is part of what makes your approach through these direct quotations to sometimes several pages of a quotation really so remarkable, especially as an archivist. Of course, I work a lot with primary source material. So it's really lovely to see the platforming of her voice and her direct feelings in a way that honors how she felt in her own terms. And I wanted to ask, I know you have a background in theater. You founded about 20 years ago a company called Gailey Road Productions. And you typically work in a specific type of theater called verbatim theater. So I wanted to ask you how this might have influenced your approach to this biography.
That's a great question. So if you haven't heard the expression verbatim theater, it's the kind of theater that's based on research, specifically interview research. Sometimes the research comes from archival historical documents, and sometimes it comes from contemporary interviews on a particular research project. And I'm always looking for accessible ways to share my research. Like all other academics, I do, traditional academic writing, but I've always been interested in finding ways to engage people in the research that I'm undertaking that is different. And so I started Gailey Road Productions, a theater where research meets theater and theater meets research, but most recently verbatim theater, where you are only using the words from people's interviews, whether they're archival interviews or whether they are contemporary interviews, is what is used to make the drama. And there's something very powerful and very compelling when people hear on stage drama and characters speaking in the words of the people who spoke them originally. It's challenging to write something dramatic and keep to the rule of only someone's own words, but that's what verbatim theater is. So having done that in my theater life, I mean, that's probably why I was so drawn to the interviews in the archival, dossier. And I'm sure that that had an influence, because I knew that even in a biography, the more that Auntie Lea's voice would be included, the more compelling the story would be.
And I have to ask, is there any plans to adapt this biography to the stage?
Yes, there is.
You heard it here first. Something that we spoke about earlier when you were discussing the introduction to your Auntie Lea in this biography is that something that was very integral to her work was her multilingualism, and how she often used that as a tool to help her connect with other people between different communities, and cross borders is the term that you use. Do you think that in turn, it was in part her multilingualism that inspired her to turn towards activism?
I think it was her multilingualism that inspired others to ask for her support in different social justice movements. For example, Rose Posada, who was the one who was brought from New York to help organize the dressmakers and then became the person who helped lead them to strike for better working conditions. Her strategy for recruiting women dressmakers was to create educational opportunities, and she needed an educational director. She herself had had great success working in the States with Spanish-speaking workers, but didn't speak French and didn't know the Quebec scene. So she needed somebody like Auntie Lea who could speak Yiddish and French and English to be her educational director. So Auntie Lea was recruited because of her ability to cross borders. Similarly, when Thérèse Casgrain was looking for people to support her movement, the suffrage movement, to give the vote to women, which they finally got in Quebec in 1940, she too was very interested in having Auntie Lea join because she was able to reach so many communities that many other people could not.
And speaking again to her collection, this is something that we see reflected a lot throughout the materials, because we see French materials. For example, a lot of these interviews that you quote from were originally conducted in French. We also have Yiddish correspondence with her family members. We have English radio scripts, one of which is on display outside if anyone wants to peek at it. So you see within her collection as well how these different languages may have played a certain role in specific parts in her life, but also how they weave together the different parts of her life, which is part of what made her the woman that she was.
I agree.
So another approach that you used in your biography is one called story merging, which is where you take an anecdote from your own life as well, or your own experiences, in order to tell the story of your Auntie Lea. My favorite such anecdote is when you share where, when you were in grade 6, you were asked by a family member who worked at the Maimonides Hospital to help clean the wards during a cleaning staff strike. However, you hesitated because you said, my Auntie Lea is going to call me a scab.
I knew all about that in grade 6.
Who didn't? So while you were using this approach of story merging, are there any new connections that you made between your life and your aunt's life that you hadn't realized before?
A story I think that moved me a lot when I was remembering it was the summer that Auntie Lea took me to the Stratford Festival, Theatre Festival in Stratford, Ontario. My grandmother Rose was going to take me and we were going to spend 4 or 5 days there. But unfortunately, she passed away in March, about a week or two before my brother Richard's bar mitzvah. And the whole family was devastated. And she was the kind of person that was so beloved. And some of you here may remember Rose Goldstein. Some of you may remember my dad, Edgar Goldstein, and that was his mom. But Auntie Lea didn't want me to miss the opportunity to be introduced to the theater in Stratford, and she took me instead. And we had a really incredible time together. I was a little nervous because she could be quite intimidating, and I'd never spent that much time with her. But I got to know her, she got to know me. And not only did we see all kinds of theater, I had a real alternative cultural experience as well. She took me to a nightclub, the Black Swan, and it was like, 70s folk music, and there was all kinds of things being smoked, and I had come from a very traditional family, and it's the first time I'd ever been to that kind of a club. She took me to my first health food store because we weren't going to buy crap when we had our picnics, and those were the experiences I remember, as well as the plays. We would go to Woolworths and sit at the counter to have breakfast, and she'd always order breakfast in Stratford, Ontario, in French. And then when the young woman who was serving at the counter, some teenage girl doing it for the summer, just looked at her blankly, she'd give her shit because she lived in a bilingual country and she should be able to serve her in French. So it was a trip at 14 where I learned about politics, I learned about alt culture, as well as saw a little bit of Shakespeare, Taming of the Shrew, we talked about sexism, Othello, we talked about racism, and there was a premiere of an Inuit folktale, and we were able to talk about settler colonialism. So it was a very important trip, and when I remembered everything that I had gotten out of it, I could see that summer, that one trip really laid the foundations for all the things that I was going to do when I was older, when I grew up.
And you also discuss in the biography that she actually worked at a theater for some time. So it really does show, even if you hadn't realized at the time, that her path was almost laying the bricks down for your own.
Certainly, she worked at Her Majesty's Theatre, and when she went to Europe, my grandmother took over that job. And when I was in my 20s, I worked at the Centaur Theatre to make money to put myself through school. And some folks may remember Festival Lennoxville at Bishop's University. I worked there for 2 summers, and so I certainly followed, Auntie Lea and my grandmother's footsteps that way.
That's really lovely. Was there anything else that surprised you when you were doing your research?
What surprised me was hearing stories from my cousins who were just a little bit older than me. There were 8 siblings in the Roback family. Auntie Lea was number 2, and my grandmother was number 4. But I have cousins whose parents, were the youngest, and I'm still connected to them. And Judith Roback in particular, hi Judith, who lives in Toronto, and I started corresponding as I started writing. And she shared some memories about what it was like to grow up in a leftist Jewish community in the 50s and 60s. She and her sister Barbara and her cousins Francie and David and Catherine would go to lefty Jewish youth groups and lefty Jewish summer camps. And I don't think I realized that that culture went to the next generation. It wasn't part of my own life, but it was certainly part of theirs.
And do you think that your Auntie Lea was any influence on that, among her siblings, among her nieces and nephews as well?
Well, I think, amongst, 8 siblings, there's going to be a range of political perspectives, right? But I do think that Leo and Michael, who were her younger brothers and the parents of my cousins, Judith, Barbara, David, Catherine, and Francine, I think that they all shared the left of center ethics and values and commitments.
Mm-hmm. And for you as well, do you think that your Auntie Lea influenced you in becoming an educator and activist in your own rights?
Well, in the biography, Auntie Lea is quoted as saying that she grew up in a Jewish family where you had to do something. You had to respond to pain and suffering in the world. You had to do something about injustice. And that certainly was passed on to me, not only through my father's family, but through my mother too, who worked with brain injured children at the Montreal Children's Hospital and integrated them into Montreal public schools in the 70s, way before any of us were talking about inclusion. And that mandate to do something, that showed up in my work for sure.
I mean, we had this discussion, but I think that phrase of do something is in some ways an overarching theme of this book.
I agree. You have to do something. And it was the heart of all of Auntie Lea's social activism and advocacy.
And with your own work at Gailey Road, we can see the same work being done.
Yes.
I wanted to also ask if there are any stories you wanted to include in this biography but didn't make it to the final version.
when the thing about Lived Places Publishing, in order to make the book accessible, they only wanted between 40 and 60,000 words. So I had to make some important choices about which activist moments in my Auntie Lea's life I would focus on. And I focused on her work in the labor movement and in the women's movement. But Auntie Lea was part of the anti-apartheid movement and part of the peace activist movement and the anti-racist movement. And there were lots of other things that she did. I talk about that a little bit, but not to the extent as I did. So there's, for any aspiring biographers, there's a beautiful archive right here. And there are many more stories to share from a different perspective.
And as you said, these are stories that are captured in her collection. We have so many files within her phone, just so many files within her phone. This woman was a very avid researcher and collector. So we have files about the anti-apartheid movement, about anti-racism, Native rights, and they're all waiting for people who wish to write a follow-up biography with her extensive research notes written on, for example, conference pamphlets or magazine clippings, newspaper articles, all of these different documents that she herself collected and then made her own comments on, like, I don't agree with that, or very salient points. And did you have a favorite part of writing this biography?
I think I mentioned it before. I really enjoyed the Growing Older chapter. It's also a chapter that talks about the Lea Roback Foundation, and it talks about all of the honors she had and the ways that the next generations had begun to take up her work.
Yeah. And it's really special being able to go into that collection and reconnect with her 25 years now after her passing, and to be able to hear her voice both in the documentary by Sophie Bissonnette, and also we have audio recordings with our archivist Irene Harris and different radios that she appeared on. And are there any questions that you wished you had the opportunity to ask your aunt before she passed away, but you didn't have the opportunity to?
So in the mid 1990s, that's when I began to do some queer and trans activism in a serious, ongoing way. It found its way into my teaching at the U of T. It found its way into my theater work. It found its way into my political work. And Auntie Lea died in the year 2000. And although I had been doing it for a couple of years, my visits in the late 90s and 2000s, I didn't have the confidence to bring it up with her. I have no doubt she would have been very interested to talk to me about all of that, but I just wasn't confident enough. I really wish that I had been, because I would love to have shared the kind of activism work that I ended up finding a home in. And I am sure that in her feminist work with the Voice of Women, that there were many many instances of queer and trans activism that she could share with me. And that would have been something that we would have had in common. So I would have loved to have done that. In writing the biography, I do write about her deep friendship with some gay men who taught her about music and fashion and theater, and being friends of gay men was something that wasn't all that socially acceptable in the places where she worked. And at one place where she worked, they asked her to not see her friends again, and she refused. So that was a story that meant a lot to me, and I think it would have been great to talk about that.
Thank you so much for sharing this, Tara. I do believe that, as you said, she was someone who had so much love in her heart and who would have been only happy to share this with you.
Thank you.